We acknowledge the Ancient Ones, the Greater Shamanic Council of Light, Hermes, both Trismegistus, and Seshet, Lady of the Measuring Cord, as above, so below, as within, so without. We acknowledge Imhotep, architect of the cosmos. May the earth be the mirror of heaven. We acknowledge the sacred order of the Magi, and all throughout history who knew, like now, a turning of the ages. We acknowledge the master builders of Göbekli Tepe and the great shining ones at Kalash, the courage and knowledge of the Polynesian wayfinders traversing the great oceans. We acknowledge the prophetic traditions of Ezekiel and Daniel, the traditions of Avalon, the Merlin, and the Round Table, the calendric wizardry of the Maya, and the Venus teachings from Mesoamerica, the Jupiter teachings originating in China, and the Vedic lunar mansion traditions, the Babylonian and Sumerian sidereal zodiacs, the brilliant Hellenistic invention of the seasonal zodiac. The Neolithic peoples around the planet, some still today, honoring the sacred connection between the land and the sky. The Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, who created a time of 2,000 years of peace, the builders of Newgrange. My teachers that are not in human form, Mount Shasta, the Grandfather Rock at the Wonderland of Rocks in Joshua Tree, Mount Haleakala on Maui, the Fish Lake Valley Hierophany, and the sacred landscapes around the planet, the astrosophy of Rudolf Steiner, and the esoteric astrology of DK and the Tibetan, both presaging the shamanic astrology paradigm, and particularly the archetypal visions of C.G. Jung and the cosmology of my mentor, Dane Rajar. For these and more, we give thanks.
Salutations from space and aloha from Earth, friends. This is Gemini Brett with the founder of the Shamanic Astrology paradigm, the vision agent of this paradigm, and the founder of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School. And here with the 10th episode of the Further Adventures of Shamanic Astrology, here is Daniel Giamario. Daniel, how in the heavens are you?
Hey, hello again, Gemini Brett. Quite well. I'm in the Philippines right now from our home, one of our two homes, the one that's near Metro Manila. So this is where I have a better internet connection. So I'm glad to be able to finally do this show. This has been building up for a long time, and this is likely to be quite a different kind of show than what we've done before.
So tell the folks what we're getting into.
Yeah. So do you want to put that up? Do you want to put up the subject matter, or shall I just go through it?
Sure. No, I can show it while you go through it. Let me share the screen here.
Yeah, the title of the show is Questioning the Assumptions of Modern Astrology, which will also then give me an opportunity to kind of explain a little more depth why the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School does things the way that they do them. So we're going to be looking at all these different issues here. Involution and evolution, overuse of sun signs, is prediction even possible? And then also a very interesting area of inquiry that I think that Gemini, Brett, and myself will have an interesting discussion about is unrecognized assumptions with language used by astrologers and nearly everyone else. We'll talk about things like rulerships, words like inferior and superior. And then also we're going to look at the hierarchical and patriarchal biases of modern astrology, and then how our assumptions about what the purpose and use of astrology has changed over time, and a proposal as to its purpose now. I was going to put in a point number 7, but it's kind of a subset of number 4 and a subset of number 5, which is assumptions about sexuality and gender, which will go into our discussion also. That's a lot on the table here. This actually comes out of, at this point now, 48 years of astrological practice, taking us back to my beginning point, which was 1969, 1970, and having the opportunity to have studied a lot of different schools of astrology and having an opportunity to sit at the feet of a number of masters that I'm extremely grateful for.
And I'll say less than 6 years for me. And I began my quest with Daniel Giamario at the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School. So may I be a Mercury to your Jupiter in this particular session. And Daniel's given me permission to play the role of, I don't want to say devil's advocate, so I'll say instead Daimon's advocate. And where even in that role, some of the things that I'll say from the so-called other side of the camp, I don't even believe, but just so that we can bring some of the square to this energy and bring the resolution from the conflict and make sure that we're honoring, at least attempting to, both sides or many sides of these contemplations, which are very charged in our time, right?
And what I also want to mention right off the top, as I do in any kind of presentation I make about shamanic astrology, that none of this is intended to make any other school of astrology wrong, but rather it's to just clarify why this particular transmission does it the way it does. And as you know, since you've known me, I love to give recognition and honor to those where most of this material has come from. It's not, I kind of synthesized a lot of this, but I can't say that I made any of it up. You know, it's just, it's a way of sensing into what works at this point and what works within the framework of the school. So if we dive into point number one, involution.
So why don't I read that, Daniel, and then I will bring you as the main screen here, then I'll come on when I want to send something from the so-called other side. So number one, involution versus evolution, Hellenistic and Neo-Platonic views versus shamanic and others. Related to this, do we assume progress when it's all really cyclical?
Yeah, so actually, in some ways, the main reason that I felt that I wanted to develop and work with a different kind of astrology than what I had been trained in was the reason why basically I wanted to call it shamanic astrology, was so we would place an equal emphasis on the journey of the soul, of spirit, coming into matter. Because what I noticed is that many of the approaches that I was familiar with in becoming an astrologer were remnants of a view that was found in both Gnosticism, it was found in Neoplatonic astrology, in Hellenistic to a certain extent, which is this sense that, oh, there's something less good or fallen about being here on this plane, in third dimensional reality, in a body, in a place of density. And there was many of the early writers that would always speak about how we need to get beyond the planets. We have to go up above into the higher realms. And well, this is what I'm referring to as evolution. It's like moving from earth and water up to air and fire, and then actually to get out of here, with kind of a one version of Buddhism. It's the kind of thing which the Dalai Lama actually inspired a huge amount of negativity and controversy when he decided to elevate shamanic Bon Tibetan traditions on the exact equal plane as the theocratic traditions of Buddhism, which were all about getting out of here, you know, like getting off the wheel. So basic shamanism would say that we want millions of lifetimes. The whole idea is to bring spirit into matter. And I wanted to actually emphasize that a lot. There's another astrologer who's written a number of papers and books on the same issue, and that's Robert Hand, well-known Robert Hand, who also speaks of restoring this kind of balance to astrology, that it's not about ascension, it's not going up and out, it's not leaving physicality, but it's actually bringing spirit deeper into the body, into the planet. And then that corresponds with the Aurobindo view, also Sri Aurobindo, who was also a revolutionary among spirituality teachers, which was about bringing spirit into matter. So that's the point that was wanting to make here regarding this. Mhm.
Yeah, I would love to add to that. One of the things that was amazingly lost in astrology for like 1,000 years was the idea of sect. And I will argue that our primary astrological experience is day and night. And so it's amazing that that was gone for that long. But the entire idea of lensing the focus at the ascendant and what is rising, as you know, Daniel, in the Hellenistic times, the ascendant is known as the horoscope, or they'll say your hour marker. So, for example, as we're recording now on May 6th, Libra is rising where I am in Seattle, and Cancer is rising where you are in the Philippines. And so we look at that kind of upward energy of the East and the ascendant. Well, the only reason why the East rises is because the Earth is falling in that direction, right? And I think so much of our astrology is focused in modern times on the trip through the secondary motion, which is the orbital motion from, for example, Aries to Taurus to Gemini, and less focused on the diurnal motion, what's known as the primary motion, rising in the east and reaching at the midheaven and resting in the west at the descendant and such.
I think the emphasis I'm trying to make here, though, is the philosophical foundations of the craft. And so many of the way that the teachers and the writers in the 20th century did it was like a remnant of the Gnostic tradition, which was that we got to get out of here, that that we need to get out of density. That's really the main point I'm trying to make here. So
absolutely. So just in agreement with that, the only reason why we ascend in the east is because the Earth is actually descending in that place. And if we honor this in both directions, we actually bring a harmony and an agreement to the evolutionary and the involutionary. So you mentioned those terms. Could you describe what evolutionary is and involutionary is in shamanic terms?
Yeah, it's like if you look at the four elements, and this is going to relate then to the later issues regarding gender, sexuality, which we'll get to in a while, is that I like to look at, and there's a diagram of this in Origins, my latest book, where basically one journey, which could be called archetypally masculine, is from earth and water going to air and fire. So it's like a pathway from, it's like it starts in form, it starts in matter, and then it's a journey up. And that would be archetypal masculine, and I would call that evolution. Well, then we would have the archetypal feminine journey, which is one of involution, beginning in spirit, but then moving down into earth and water. So we have a complementary motion there. So I'm using evolution and involution in that sense. One is a journey up and away from density, and the other is down and in deeper into earth and water. So that's how I'm using the terms.
And Hermes said, "Separate thou sweetly and with great ingenuity the fire from the earth," right? And that kind of alchemical view of fire is the least dense and earth is the most dense. And engaging with this through the elements is a beautiful study. But even before the four elements, we have the chalice and the blade. And this idea that fire and air, the glyphs that we use for those elements, rise on their evolutionary quest, and then the earth and the water, a down and inward experience. And this demonization over time of embodiment in the heart, the water is in the body, right? So so much of what shamanic astrology, I believe, is doing, and many in the modern quest, is to retrieve this beauty of embodiment, this beauty of coming to earth and getting out of this trip that the whole trip is to get out of here. And rather, as you're saying, Daniel, that it's about fully embodying and fully coming in, as I like to say, to play in the earth game.
Well, it's just in summary of this point, is to create a balance or an equality between involution and evolution. And then, as because of the way I'm defining the terms, also between masculine and feminine archetypally. But more about that when we get down to that part of this. In some ways, the next part of this, do we assume progress when it's all really cyclical? That could actually be the subject of a whole additional show. What I was referring to there was the fact that if we look back over the history of even the last 6,000 years, look in China, look at India, different parts of the world, there will be times where the prevalent view is mechanistic, deterministic, linear, cause and effect. And then there will be a counter movement against that, which is bringing back in correspondence, synchronicity, as above, so below. And these waves have gone back and forth throughout the last 5,000 or 6,000 years. And so that's why I don't necessarily believe the current way the world is currently is an indication of progress. In fact, I basically look at us being near the end of Kali Yuga at this point, where essentially for the average, for the whole collective population, it is said in Kali Yuga terms that only 1/4 of the heart is fully available near the end of Kali Yuga. And that I don't see what's happened with patriarchy, with warfare, with certain dominator approaches, certain hierarchical approaches as being progress, but rather in some senses a regression. And but then if we look at, rather than judging it entirely as a regression, we're looking at it as a much larger cycle. So these things cycle around. And I have actually, since probably the late 60s, have been a major critic of those who believe in technological progress, or the whole myth of progress, it's been called. And way more I'm into a cyclical view and how it is that, in fact, different cultures and different kinds of people are going to relate more to maybe a mechanistic approach, or others will relate more to a correspondence approach. So that's why I was throwing that in there.
I've had this experience several times now where I, like you, have the opportunity and the honor to bring people out to the sky who don't know that that's Mars or that's Saturn. And typically what I'll do is not say that, and first allow people hopefully to release themselves from the feelings of shame that they don't know all these things, and just say, no, the awe and the wonder of it all, that's the original medicine. Right. So get in that space, and there's one, and there's one, and pick a planet, and I'm going to drum and have a journey there. And the experience is that in sharing afterwards what people have received, and this is 3 times now come from elders and from women who went to Saturn and came back with this vision of grandmother time, who was releasing from this idea of linearity and evolution on some straight line, and to see that time is the circle and the cycle. And it's such a beautiful thing that resonates with your teachings around the Capricorn mysteries, for example, as the Council of Grandmothers and the Council of Elders. And I really love that image of Saturn now in Capricorn, perhaps helping us retrieve that true earth-based foundation of cyclical nature. So Earth and then sun, because our second point here is the overuse of sun signs.
Yeah, this actually started for me very, very early on. I had the great fortune of having my first teacher share with me in much the way that Hellenistic is, I guess, that the moon and the ascendant occupied a far more important place than a sun sign. But then I began to notice in working with people that very rarely does that individual evidence the descriptions of the sun sign. The times where they did evidence the general description of a sun sign was actually if a woman had Venus in the same sign as the sun, or a man had Mars in the same sign as the sun, then they often did seem like that sort of generalized sun sign description. But the real the kind of the breakthrough for me happened through some of my early research with a writer named Frederick van Nostrand. He hasn't been remembered much recently. And he had, in this one of the books I had of his, he was talking about how sun signs became popular in the 1800s through newspaper columns, because it was very, very easy to put people in a range of dates, and then people could find that out. You have to remember that at that time period, you'd be hard pressed to find maybe even one person in a city that even has the books to tell you the other stuff. You know, you were born with the moon in, Libra, or you have Aries rising or whatever. So this ended up popularizing sun signs. And then it caught on in a way that I think has done a great deal of damage to our real craft. So that's why we really de-emphasized sun signs as a means of interpretation. But that by no means it would indicate that we devalue the sun itself. So in shamanism, and actually just in our experience, the sun is like the only thing that you can't look at for very long without turning away. I mean, I look at the sun as being the most direct manifestation of great mystery itself. And even if we look at the way we do charts in the synodic cycles, in the sun-moon angles, basically the sun is what we measure everything off from. So it is sun-centered in that way. But I think we do great damage to great mystery and to the sun when we project an archetype onto it. And to try, so the actual more specific expressions of the human personality and individuality, I think, is not found in the sun sign. So that's people were curious about that, because there's, shamanic astrology doesn't really care that much about your sun sign. We care very much about the sun, but not to project some mundane understanding. In fact, I've noticed that a lot of the descriptions of sun signs, like I'm a Taurus or I'm a Gemini, these are actually descriptions of the shadow of those mystery schools.
Yeah.
And are not really revealing the significance of being born at that time.
Sometimes I've had this feeling that maybe the church, having tried to cast astrology aside entirely and not being able to do so, instead lensed it in such a way where we could play only with the shadow essence of the archetypes, so we would know why we should come to the church and repent.
Probably
but,
so.
We can say for sure that sun sign astrology became very dominant, as you were describing, kind of in the times of newspaper, because everyone knows their birthday, and then it's easy, unless you're right at a cusp, to find your sun sign and go to that place of what we call horoscopes these days, being a newspaper column, where really the horoscope, as you first taught me, is not even the chart itself, but actually the sign of the ascendant. But I think knowing in the so-called Copernican revolution and coming to a heliocentric cosmology as beings on a planet that's orbiting the sun, perhaps this was also part of the impetus for the solar dominance in astrology. Do you agree?
Not really. I mean, maybe this is what maybe other people have questioned you about that. I think it has much more to do with the domination of patriarchy, that turning everything into one God, one male God, quite frankly. This will come up again when we get down to some of the other points. But in the 70s, I was hugely influenced by people like Tony Joseph in his work, the remythologizing of astrology, and James Hillman and his work, and not as an astrologer, but as a way of bringing archetypal psychology into it. And the thing that became impressed upon me was that the soul is polytheistic. It's not monotheistic. That there are many, many gods and goddesses that operate within our psyche, many different archetypes. And to enshrine just one above the others is buying into fundamentalistic monotheism and patriarchy. And I think that's the danger of the enshrinement of the sun. There's a whole other point that I intend to make on this, which has to do with whether or not the sun is in fact masculine at all.
Yeah, it's a wonderful point. I'll share. I like to express the idea of the sun as the key of the song, where I see a birth chart as someone's soul song. And a great thing about, musicians know this, we could all choose to play in the key of G and also decide not to play the note G, which is kind of a trick for a bass player mostly. But we can do that, and the trained ear will still understand that we're playing in the key of G because it's an archetype. So as you're saying, when we're working with the phase of the moon, or where the moon is in the lunisolar cycle, the synodic cycle, or the synodic cycle of the other planets, are the morning star, evening star, are they visible or invisible? We're really engaging with the Earth's motion, the primary motion. As the Earth spins, did Venus rise before the sun or set after the sun, for example? And it really brings back a lot of our witness and our shamanic experience of the heavens, which isn't part necessarily, unless you go old school, of the rule set and such.
Right.
But maybe we should speak about the sun as the patriarch, or, even in the tablets, Hermes says the sun is its father, the moon is its mother, the wind hath carried it in its belly.
I would say that it's very possible that is representing the time that it was written. There's a great deal of controversy about when that was actually written. And
True.
I certainly believed it that way in Hellenistic times. But I have some another view on this, which I don't know. I wasn't ready to go to it now, but it has to do with how the sun and the moon can be both masculine and feminine, which I think is really important to take into account here. Maybe I will go into that now, since
let's go there.
You brought it up. I'm going to just read a portion of my most recent book called The Origins of the Shamanic Astrology Paradigm. And this is research I did when I was in Ireland some years ago. And this will also open the door to the subject about sexuality and gender, which I think is an important discussion for us to have. So countless examples exist in the current age demonstrating tremendous confusion about sexuality and gender. There seems to be no consistent agreement or consensus about what men or women are supposed to be. What are the definitions of masculinity and femininity? And this is one of the most important questions I think we can ask, but I want to jump ahead to one other thing here so you can see the clue that we're missing. In pondering these issues, I read an amazing article by Rene Malamud in his book, Facing the Gods, edited by James Hillman. Quote, "The discussion involved gender descriptions and assumptions about masculine and feminine as being projections. I came upon the following quote, "The projection does not lie where the first glance indicates it to be, i.e., in biological or sociological conditions, but in the psychic polarity between Luna and Sol." Exactly. The projection exists even beyond the recognition of the recent historical impact of the patriarchal expressions of male-female roles, and seeing these as the projections that they are. Beyond the obvious physical differences between men and women is found this unexamined and often unquestionably accepted major projection. Most people I've known assume the sun is masculine and the moon is feminine. Isn't this assumption obvious? Well, actually not really. The further one goes back into history, the more often than not the discoveries made of the many moon gods and the many sun goddesses. Even Thoth himself was a moon god. Even now in the German and Japanese languages, the word for sun is feminine, and there's a masculine word for the moon. Although this is not an exhaustive list, the following languages have a masculine moon and a feminine sun: Norwegian, Lithuanian, German, Teutonic, Sanskrit, Swedish, Ancient Anglo-Saxon, Sumerian, Arabic, Egyptian, Japanese, and many from South America. The Norse word Suna, for which we get the word sun, is the moon goddess, is the sun goddess. And the Anglo-Saxon word Mona, M-O-N-A, is a masculine word for the moon god. These words are, of course, the originals for the English sun and moon. Meanwhile, Latin, French, Greek, Italian, Portuguese, generally all the Romance languages have it the, quote, usual way. In Egypt, the goddess Sekhmet is the sun goddess. Thoth is the moon god. In mythic Ireland, Grain, also Grian and Grain, was the sun goddess. Brigid, there's so many spellings of her name, was also a solar goddess. Diarmid may be the moon god. There are also many sun gods in Ireland. Anyway, we could go on and on and on with this, and I'm not attempting here to say that it should be the reverse. You know, maybe the sun should be feminine and the moon masculine. I'm saying that basically masculinity and femininity, gods and goddesses, are in both. And the problem, to a certain extent, is really in the language. Because the thing is a lot of people will be critical of the English language. But one of the greatest things about the English language is they got rid of gender descriptions for words. I mean, Aryan languages, Indo-European languages, Romance languages, they all have like this gender thing they put onto it. In fact, until the 1950s, the word gender was only with reference to grammar. The word gender wasn't even used the way it is today. At this point, sometimes substituting for sex. So that's a whole other part of our discussion.
Sure. I'll say one of my favorite examples in that world of a so-called gendered language is in Spanish, you say los planetas. So it has the masculine los, like el, but then planetas is the feminine. And it's showing us this, if you're going to say masculine and feminine, at least they each have both of that. And we should say in many ways, they're probably above that idea of duality also. But in the old codes and rules, and we're going to get into some of this stuff today, the domiciles of the planets, every planet had a nocturnal and a diurnal house or sign, except for sun and moon. However, there are some old techniques, I spoke with Robert Hand about this, that sees the sun not only in Leo, but also in Cancer, and moon not only in Cancer, but also in Leo. As I said, I like to describe sun as the key of the song. The idea in like the Shamanic Astrology teachings of it is great mystery, right? You cannot stare at the sun without going blind. If you learn to, you no longer need food or something anyway. But that idea for me, the sun in this way really represents the all and the one thing from Hermetic language. So if we get back to the tablets where sun is the father, moon is the mother, well, what is the wind hath carried it in its belly, and the earth is its nurse? You know, obviously that quadrant of the doctrine, it feels to me that it's speaking more about fire, water, air, and earth, and the four elements.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, as I like to be, and I think even the words in the Emerald Tablets are a function of the way that culture at that point saw it.
But, you know, even in the Hellenistic times, like I just did a workshop with Robert Ham, which is about how to find your parents in the chart. And he literally found in my own that Venus represents my father.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole thing that's part of my research right now. And I plan to be writing something pretty strong about it. It could have actually been part of our discussion today. which is a decision I made in the 70s, which is to see masculinity and femininity in the signs equally and in the planets equally. And because to me, that's also a vestige. This is like on point number 5 of today, the hierarchical and patriarchal biases of modern astrology. Having been an astrologer in the early 70s at the time of finally getting the ephemeris for the big 4 asteroids, which were all goddesses, that really helped to bring the feminine back in. But I wanted to take it even a step further, to see the masculinity and femininity in each sign and in each planet. And as we know, that those of us that have been working with the synodic cycles, that there are certain cultures, it wasn't just the Mayans, who saw a certain portion of the rising of Venus, the early part of the morning star Venus, as being male.
Including Greek, at times, for sure. And certainly the Latin and I guess I'll just keep what's coming alive out of that for now. But one thing I'll share is so much of my adventure lately has been through sacred geometry. And I think part of the challenge in my culture here in Seattle is there's a lot of folks who are in the kind of non-binary movement. And it's such a trip for me where I feel like it used to be cool to talk about gender, but not to talk about sex. And now it's totally cool in this culture to talk about sex. And by that, I actually mean coitus in this example, but not about gender. Like you can't say feminine and masculine. And that's like, so we can say, well, yin and yang. But a really lovely way that it was actually described back in the day is in nocturnal and diurnal. And that's a beautiful part of this idea of sect light, that those of you folks like Daniel who were born with the sun above the horizon are of the day sect, and the sun is just said to be your primary light, and those like myself born after sunset are of the night, and then the moon is the sect light. And so there's some interesting stuff, although certainly the patriarchal language and just the kind of fear-based language in a lot of the old texts is hard to get for me personally. But I love thinking of this idea of do some of the signs actually have a diurnal focus and do some have a nocturnal focus? And the last thing I'll share around that, just from the geometry traditions, is it's often said that we have our curve, which is the compass, and our line, which is the rule. And I love to say, we have both. Like if I decide to drive from Seattle to San Francisco right now, the line says the fast way is I-5. That's like straight and short. And the curve says boring. Let's take the coast and see what happens. But if you do this thing, even the symbol that we use for the sun, which is the circle of spirit, it's all curve. There's a hidden ray, which is the radius, which is the line. That's actually the only thing you can measure. We don't know the circumference. It's that radius times 2 times pi, which in math they say is irrational, but I prefer the term mysterious, because I think even that term irrational is some of this patriarchal languaging that you're speaking about in regards to the curve and to the cyclical and to that side.
I would like to get back to this other part of the discussion on masculine and feminine. Okay. And this is how I'm approaching it at this point, because as I mentioned earlier, the word gender is used very differently today than at any other time. In fact, if you go through the writings of feminists in the 70s and 80s, they were confused about it. Sometimes they would use sex when they meant gender, and sometimes they would use gender when they meant sex. I think it's really wonderful to have maybe 15, 20, 25, 30 genders. I mean, which would basically have all these different possibilities that are not commanded by the culture that we're born into, or the suppositions about how men and women are supposed to be. But back to like where my starting point would be. As a starting point, the approach of this book makes a clear distinction between the physical, biological reality of a man and a woman and whatever masculinity and femininity actually are archetypally. Men as biological organisms can be defined as having XY chromosomes with male genitalia or lingam using the more elegant non-English word. Women are XX chromosome beings with female genitalia, including the yoni. That part is clear. We're leaving out of this discussion the complex issues dealing with transsexual and with hermaphrodism. But how does this translate into masculinity and femininity? The word gender, for example, does not help much because until recently, gender simply meant the usual and conventionally ascribed characteristics of how masculinity and femininity are believed to be, as defined by a specific culture and a specific time period in history. And I mean, this all was like up in the air in the early 70s. And I've gone actually pretty extreme with this, which is that virtually anything of a definition of what a man is supposed to be and what a woman is supposed to be is completely an artifact of the culture. That there's literally nothing about it that is of essence. But there's still, we can be an XX chromosome being or an XY chromosome being. And so, but you're not forced to be any of the social roles. You can be any gender you want. So that's how I'm approaching it these days.
There's something that I really wanted to get into you with, or with you about, Daniel. I'm having a hard time with my words today, but it was that idea, and maybe it's not for today, but about the patrilineal like naming system and how our DNA actually really keeps like the name of the feminine. And if you want to go there, maybe you could describe why that is from a genetic standpoint. Like, for example, my dad can find out more about his own particular genome if I take the test than if he did, because of the way that, let's just say the feminine line is kind of more evident in the genetic coding.
Yeah, well, because briefly, this would be the part of something for a whole other show, which is one of the major features of that big question that we've explored in some of the other shows. You know, who are we and what the hell happened? But if you're looking at DNA, the female line, it cannot be eradicated. I mean, it can be killed off, but I mean, it cannot be eradicated by men impregnating women. I mean, this has been attempted many times. Genghis Khan approach, you know, you go into a place, you kill off all the competitive males and you impregnate as many females as possible. I mean, they found out in Ireland, for example, that about 1/5 of the Irish men all had the same clan father. The same guy called Niall of the Seven Hostages, who actually was a Irish version of Genghis Khan trying to do that. But lo and behold, no matter how many times they try to do that, the female line goes all the way back to the original clan mothers, of which I think there's 8 in Europe, and I think they found as many as 32 or 33 around the world at this point. Yeah, so that's a whole, that to me, the unspoken thing that almost never anyone talks about. And again, this would be part of a whole other show because it's beyond the scope of subjects today. Is that we can rail against hierarchical patriarchy. We can certainly perceive the problems of fundamentalism in monotheistic religions, but almost no one ever mentions the huge difference in the world between the cultures that had a matrilineal descent and those who have a patrilineal descent. I mean, even going to Egypt, it's like there's a huge difference between the Berber people you meet and the Nubians that all were originally matrilineal until, of course, along comes the latter transmissions that came down basically from the Kargan invasions that changed the whole system. And to me, that is every bit as much as a problem as the other things people always mention.
Right, to further that seeding for another show, because I would really love to explore that. Mm-hmm. We might say that in more Paleolithic times, or even more earth-based and shamanic societies, it's more of a matriarchal culture. And in this question of what happened,
not always, actually.
Not always, but it seems like in the work of Gambitas, for example, right? But in this question of what happened, one of my great explorations in my meditations lately is, okay, well, patriarchy, it's not the masculine, it's the false masculine. And if I'm sitting with one of my own personal wounds and looking to heal that, then I want to get into the root of the wound. What is that? And so I love asking this question of like, what happened to the masculine that there would be this reaction that's led to this mess? Or what was it that happened to earthlings? Like, as you and I well know, our population was bottlenecked after most likely some significant cataclysm. And then what were the survival tactics for the continuation of the species? And I think in that contemplation, we can see some of the answers to these mysteries of the result. And so I think another show, because there's other things.
Let's have that be a further focused discussion on that. I have a lot of material that we can get into about that.
Cool. So let's get back on track with number 3. Is prediction even possible?
Yeah, for a long time in the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School, we've de-emphasized prediction. That's really not the main function of astrology. Well, one of the, I can give several examples of this, about the debacle that happened at the ESAR conference, where they had the whole panel of people to predict who's going to win the election. And every one of them was wrong, and there were people who didn't wish to participate in that because of their belief was that astrology is not about prediction. Well, I've been recently very much influenced. I mean, one of my favorite of all astrologers on the planet is Jeffrey Cornelius, who I first met in the 70s and in Los Angeles when I lived there, and he contributed a fair amount of blew my mind open in a few ways at that point. And then getting his book, The Moment of Astrology, and then having a private discussion with him at the last UAC, it really confirmed what I felt for a long time, that the reason the prediction is not possible is because objective time does not exist. And that his whole point is that astrology is really divination. And that at any moment, there are certain conditions that are true in that moment, and it becomes alive because of the connection between the astrologer and the person who you are speaking with. So it's a sacred act. It's coming from beyond. It's not something that can be quantified. It's not something you can do statistics on, that it's actually a magical act of divination. The other thing that Jeffrey also emphasizes, that he thinks that astrology made a wrong turn by overemphasizing the birth chart. In much the same way that you go to a psychic reader, and they might be able to read what was true in that moment, but everything is changing. There's that principle of quantum mechanics. I mean, like, I think it was what's her name? Elizabeth Kobler wrote, can't think of her name right now. Coda Robles, who basically said that a prediction or a prophecy of something negative that turns out as a failed prophecy. that basically the act itself of doing a reading is tuning in to the synchronicities that are happening between two human beings in connection with spirit, which is why the incredible importance that we emphasize in shamanic astrology of the soul-to-soul connection, and a kind of a rejection of the Gauquelin approach that let's just do statistics and try to prove something. You cannot quantify intent, and intent is continually changing. It's beyond just the birth chart. The birth chart is like a seed, but it doesn't control everything, which is why any astrologer who's been doing a practice for a long time knows that sometimes Saturn is really literal. Other times it's not.
Yeah, and so to honor some of the old techniques, like annual perfections, there is a claim that you can predict whether a Saturn return, for example, is going to be very Saturnian or not. because sometimes people have a Saturn return in a Saturn year. And so just to play like Diamond's advocate here, where some predictive astrologers or neo-traditional astrologers will claim that the reason why astrology can't be used for predictions anymore is because we've thrown away some of the old rules. I want to read this passage. This is from Deb Holding's The Houses, Temples of the Sky. And it's from the third chapter called Aspects and Gates. And she writes, one way in which modern astrology often fails to utilize the full potential of house signification is in reducing them all to the same strength and efficacy, ignoring the fact that location within the sphere impacts upon the prominence and force or inhibition and weakness of planetary expression. In our eagerness to avoid the negative undertones of words like malefic, unfortunate, and destructive, we must be wary of not inverting this essential influence of the houses or of limiting their value by being prejudiced towards everything having a constructive, creative, or superficially positive interpretation. The eighth house remains the house of death, loss, and grief, no matter how pleasantly we wrap that up in digestible phrases such as personal transformation.
Well, to me, all that's sharing is it's like it's setting up a black or white kind of thing. The alternative to the deterministic view of the past is not to make everything all rosy and nice. There's something in between there. I mean, so to me, that is a complete overreaction. To me, this is going to be a strong statement that I'll make, but I think most of that stuff in traditional or in medieval or even in Hellenistic astrology, although it gained some many major insights from it, I think is a product of the time and is no longer useful. And we have to really move beyond the time frame of which it existed in. And that brings us actually to the subject of the unrecognized assumptions with language. We did masculine and feminine, but in some of the words that are used by astrologers, again, I don't have any problem with other schools of astrology continuing to use the old words. But I like to explain why in shamanic astrology we have changed the language to assist people of leaving behind the traps of cultural relativity and hierarchical judgment and the things that happen in the mind when we hear words.
There's a thing Alan Watts says, that thinks are things, and so much training and manifestation of re-languaging, our play-by-play and our internal narration so that the reflection of our external world would become more productive for us. So productive and predictive is a really wonderful play. But I mean, even in that passage I just read, we hear, and she puts in these quotes, malefic, unfortunate, destructive, other words like debilitated or inferior that we'll explore, or even rulership itself. I did want to read another passage from this book because I think it's in agreement with the shamanic astrology intent of, as I like to say, renaturing astrology, where she's basically speaking about the difference between the primary and the secondary motion. And she says, for modern students, a major reversal is required to fully comprehend the ancient empirical basis of the astrological techniques in use today. The symbolic importance of the cycles that occur around us are only perceived if we lift our eyes and our minds from our static two-dimensional charts and reconnect with celestial motions as they are experienced by human senses, rising in the east, culminating in the south. And she has a note there to say culminating in the south, that's a northern hemisphere thing, because in the southern hemisphere, culminating in the north, and declining in the west. And she goes on, I don't need to read further, but I love that impetus because, with my students, I love to say, well, why do we express this thing that the 12th house is hidden things? Well, like where I'm sitting right now, if I look east, it's a bunch of trees and houses and a hill. Like there's no way I can possibly see what star is rising over there, even if it's nighttime. And so when we renature astrology, we can connect to some of these suggestions of the places or the houses and some of these old expressions, which come through in too heavy of a way to work with constructively in our time. But I think it's an interesting argument to say, well, maybe these old ways, which are lensed in very difficult patriarchal language, we want to make sure we don't throw away the information as we relanguage, because the argument would be we're also losing our ability to connect to prediction.
But I hear that, and of course, I was hugely influenced by Project Hindsight. I got a lot of marvelous insights from that went into the shamanic astrology paradigm. But what this whole thing, though, the bottom line that Jeffrey Cornelius is saying, and I really agree with it, it has been my experience as an astrologer, and he points this out, that a lot of times when you're in the zone, it does not matter how many years experience you've had as an astrologer, how many, thousands of readings you've done, how many hundreds of techniques you use in that particular moment of sitting with another individual who is open for inquiry into about their soul's journey, that magic happens. That's the divination that is taking place at that point. And I personally have no interest at all in any empirical verification of any of this stuff, because astrology is existing in a different place. It's
Right.
not a place of science. It's not a place of statistics. So in
my worldview, I will say that astrology very much is a sacred science, and I say let's keep it sacred by honoring the scientific and keep it scientific by honoring the sacred. They're two different realms. I found a lot of joy at a talk at the Norwalk conference last year given by Robert Hand, which was speaking about the importance of intuition. And he was actually reading from ancient doctrines supporting that.
Particularly Ficini.
Right.
More than anyone.
And I love that, because there's forums where anyone who's speaking about their, to use New Age nomenclature, the hits that they received during a reading that just opened up this thing. They don't know how they saw it in the chart, but they went there and it's powerful, right, or magic as you described it. And there's forums where people say, oh, well, you might as well be reading tea leaves. Well, first of all, tea leaves reading is a science in and of itself. Right, but second of all, the rejection of that intuitive self, we might even say like the empathic and the feeling-based self, is more of this kind of demonization of humanity versus just kind of the intellectual or like up and out experience of astrology as a science. But is prediction real? I mean, even if we say, here comes a Pluto transit and it's totally unpredictable, that is a prediction. And
no, I would disagree with that. All you're doing is describing a particular season, a particular time frame that you can assist a person in navigating. I mean, that's no different than predicting that, oh my gosh, we're living at 50-degree latitude, and so there's going to be different seasons at different times. I particularly noticed this with Uranus, where I said, I'm sorry, I have no idea what is going to happen here, but I can tell you the time frame for which such a thing can take place. And then it's up to you to tune in to see what the intent of those experiences are going to be. And so there's that aspect of it, but I would never predict anything whatsoever. That, to me, that takes it away from the magic of the exchange between the souls and the ineffable qualities that really exist in our craft. And I don't know. I mean, I do respect a lot of the people that are trying to find, some subtle scientific thing that can actually prove astrology, but that's like a whole. It's all like besides the point. It really doesn't matter. What matters is the fact that such a thing as this great mystery and its connection to human beings who have their hearts and souls open is real, and that we can connect with, just like Rajar's expression of what happens when you are born.
So, yeah, I'll take that from two sides. One is a quote that I first heard from Rajar that I love, which I guess is a Chinese proverb, though I haven't been able to track it down. But it's that any fool can count the number of seeds in an apple, not the wisest being can count the number of apples in a seed. And I love that as an expression of astrology, or for example, a natal chart, that this is a game of potentials, not promises. I like to say the chart is the song, and there's some fate there, because again and again, I read these dates to people and they laugh and they cry. That's when I met him. That's when dad died, whatever. But also free will, we can dance to a song any way we choose. We can even choose not to dance at all, which seems to be status quo. But so if we say, well, winter is coming, that doesn't say this is how you have to deal with it, or this is what's going to happen. It's just going to be a little colder. Or Pluto is coming. So one thing about the idea of natal astrology, I mean, you know, from the old doctrines, the idea is any kind of direction, like transits or secondary progressions or whatever it may be, nothing's going to be activated that isn't part of the promise. I prefer the word potential of the nativity. I mean, even transit charts, they're all completely based on systems of time from the birth moment, right? So that's one side of the thing. The other side of the thing is this, like, I mean, horary astrology, right? So for people out there who don't know what this is, it's you ask me a question, like somebody stole my bike, I want to get it back, where is it? I cast a chart for the moment you ask the question, and the chart, and many swear to this, will tell me who took it, where it is, will you get it back, will you not? It's 3.5 miles to the northwest under a house or something like that. I mean, I've seen amazing cases like this.
This book that I referred to, The Moment of Astrology, most of the whole book is about horary, because that is, of course, divination. That's what that is.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, so it's very, very important. And so the birth chart is a divination also. These are all a divination. It's not science. It's not something that is statistically valid or true. And what Cornelius says very honestly in the book is he's worked with the greatest horary people in England. It's very big in England, horary. And more than half the time, it's not accurate. You know, so it's like he's much more interested in the ethics and the morality around it. So that if you're going to do a horary, it's not, will I marry the guy or not? The horary should be, should I marry the guy?
Right, but if it's, where are my fucking car keys, right? And then suddenly the chart reveals this, and it does so in a very scientific way. The argument from the other side, and I'm not saying I'm one of them, like I love that the first horary book that I engaged with this little pamphlet by Alan Leo, and he does this great warning at the beginning, which I really love. He's like, do not do this for every question in your life. The more that you go to the cards, go to the chart, the less you are giving power to your own personal free will.
It's the same thing with the I Ching or consulting any oracle. But actually a good portion of the book I'm referring to goes into two very famous cases where the horary worked. And he goes into, including one that had to do with 500 years of history. and he goes into why, in his view, it worked at that point. And it had to do with the morals and ethics and the significance of it. And so you don't do it just any day, every day to do a horary. It's just like you don't get a reading every day. It's
right.
The same.
So like William Lilly is famous for having his servants hide things from him and then casting charts to find them. But how much was that completely based on his predictions and his gnosis, like psychologically, of who these people were and where they would hide stuff? But to be able to show that in the chart, I just like insert that as exhibit A in astrology. Like I kind of don't want to look into horary, because what does that say, if it is real, about the cosmology of the universe? And frankly, for me personally, it's a little bit terrifying. And it's not necessarily where I've devoted my own energetic as a healer in astrology. But I am totally fascinated by it and am interested in studying it, because it does hold some of the roots of our craft. But some will swear, well, it doesn't work unless you use a Regiomontanus house system, which is such a different trip than whole sign or Campanus or the...
I'm just curious, are you familiar with the book I'm referring to?
I'm not. I own it. I own it, so I'm familiar with that. It sits over here on the shelf, but I have not read it.
It's so incredible. There's just one more point I want to make regarding this whole issue of prediction, and it's how certain experiences in spiritual schools informed my understanding of this, which made me able to grasp what Cornelius was saying. This is insights that came from the Diamond Heart work. In the Diamond Heart work, they basically use the Enneagram. And one of the points on the Enneagram is the point number 7. And it's referred to as the holy plan. That is to say that the one reality that we find ourselves in has a plan to it. Just like there's a will to it, there's love to it. But anyway, one of the points on the one reality is a plan, a holy plan. Well, what I've noticed is that so many astrologers love 7. That is, many of them are 7s, because there is such a thrill at getting close to experience the holy plan. Oh my God, it's like looking under the skirts of her, you know, like to really get close to how the whole one reality is unfolding. This is if you don't have that, you probably don't want to. I mean, that to me is a key to wanting to be an astrologer, is that thrill. It's like an erotic experience, really, to be able to sense into that holy plan. But here's the rub. We're part of the unfolding. It is impossible for the astrologer to be objective to the unfolding of the one thing. So that renders prediction from a scientific perspective completely impossible. All you can do is get close. But since there is no such thing as objective time, then the whole thing falls apart.
I think because we're an hour in and there's other topics to address, that we should allow that just to live in that place of tension, because we could do that for another hour or two. But it's an amazing almost division, which shouldn't be in astrology right now, as these philosophies of can we predict, and is that what it's about, or can we not, and that's what it's about, or even maybe a third stream, yes we can, but we should not, right? Right. But I think it's because there's really important topics on the list here. Maybe we should move on to the languaging topic. Does that feel right?
I was going to suggest pausing for a moment.
Okay, hold on one second, and we'll be right back. Well, folks, behind the scenes, Daniel right now has got to prepare for a flight to Bali, where there is a shamanic astrology training on Earth in person. And so we decided that we're going to continue this topic in 10 and a half of the further explorations of shamanic astrology, where we will get back into this list. I'm going to share my screen and we'll look together. More into the hierarchical and patriarchal biases of modern astrology. Very importantly, what is the purpose of astrology now? So point 6 here, how are our assumptions about what the purpose and use of astrology has changed over time, and proposal as to its purpose now. And also to really engage more deeply and with specific examples around unrecognized assumptions with language used by astrology and nearly everyone else, as Daniel writes here. Examples: rulerships, exalted, detriments, opposition, inferior or superior, masculine, feminine, etc. You're watching this on YouTube, I assume, and down below in the description section, you'll find a list of resources and this 6-point list of our topics here of questioning the assumptions of modern astrology. So for Daniel Giamario, this is Gemini Brett signing off. We will see you in space. Please give this video a like and share it around. And we would love to hear comments about what you think. A lot of these topics are totally charged, and I just want to honor my teacher and Daniel for giving me space to retort and play that diamond's advocate, as I'm fond of saying in this moment. All right. Love and planets to you.